that delayed things this morning, but with it now. So yeah, this morning I want to talk to you about neuromodulation for chronic pain. Now I just need to, yes. So really, our mission is about giving people access to alternatives to opioids, and in some cases allowing people complete freedom from pain, and in other cases allowing people an extra tool in their toolkit. The scale of the problem, 100 million Americans with chronic pain currently. Last year there were 72,000 opioid deaths. Now 4/5 of those started with prescription opioids. So this is not a junkie problem. This is a everyone going in for surgery problem, and then other problems taking over. So it starts with opioids used to reduce pain, and then morphs into self-medication for things like anxiety and stress that end up with the problems we have. So the more we can do to provide alternatives to opioids, the more hopefully we can mitigate this number. One of the essential problems with opioids is that they don't actually kill pain. They are not pain killers. They mask pain, they hide pain. So if you look at all of the biological markers for stress and fight flight in the body, your body stays in fight flight all of the time that you're actually in pain when you're on opioids. They just hide it. I know all about this stuff because that was me, 1992. A couple of hours after that photo was taken, I was forced to drive that Jeep off a bridge in order to avoid a head-on collision with a petrol truck, gasoline truck, and that resulted in spinal injuries from T8 to T10. I don't know if you saw from the picture earlier, but I am now I'm still a wheelchair user. But back then, I had a nerve damage pain problem that was so severe, I was given a 5-year life expectancy. Essentially, what happens is that once you're over a certain level of pain, you can't get any slow wave sleep. So I was given all of the typical standard of care at the time, which really hasn't changed a lot in 25 years. So it starts with opioids. I quickly built up a resistance to opioids, and that happens in about 40% of people where opioids just simply stop working completely. Anyway, so they put me through all of the standard external and internal devices. Here are their modern equivalents 26 years later. Not a huge amount of development in any of the electrical stim technology. The big med device companies would argue with that and say there's lots of things that have happened since then to improve it, but outcomes haven't improved a lot since then. So spinal cord stimulators, typically there seems to be a drop off after about 2 years of whatever efficacy you get, it stops after a couple of years. And then you've got the TENS devices and the modern TENS equivalents that basically are usually grandfathered in under 1976 FDA rules, but not a lot of help for chronic pain. Useful for some kinds of acute muscular pain, difficulties in other areas. So even when I was in the hospital, I started looking at what is broadly called brainwave entrainment. The brainwave entrainment is essentially you take a signal and you give it to the brain, and then the brain adopts that frequency. So the most well-known aspects of that are, and most well-studied, are magnetic. So you've got TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. You've got electrical, which includes the implantables, some of which have really good efficacy, like the deep brain stimulation device by Medtronic for Parkinson's. But none of those have much efficacy shown for chronic pain. So I started looking at audiovisual. Now, the reason why I focused on audiovisual, well, 2 reasons. One is my initial breakthrough came in a hospital watching a film. And that particular film took me in and out of pain, depending on how good the film was at the time. Fast-paced set pieces, my brain went into what we'd now call a flow state. Really bad dialogue and script in between times, a device would then come out of that flow state. So I started looking at that, and my initial film experience is essentially what you have with modern day VR work on chronic pain. It's distraction therapy. It's useful in certain circumstances, but it's short term. So I started looking for how can I make this a reliable signal that I could repeat anytime I was in pain. And this is what my earliest device looked like. I had two desktops either side of my bed, one powering the audiovisual stimulus, the other powering the EEG. So I was using my own very, very severe levels of pain as a extremely sensitive barometer of how that light and sound was affecting the brain. And I was using the EEG to back that up with objective data of how my brain was responding to the audiovisual signal. So now this is basically what the device looks like. We have the valence cell sensor on the forehead with a big blue arrow pointing at it. And we've got light pulsing through eyes and sound coming through the ears. Now, that early EEG system was brilliant for working out what algorithms we needed in terms of how the light and sound were being pulsed at the brain. But EEG, when it comes to building a usable device that we now have, was a problem. Because you've either got, with EEG, you've got two kinds of electrode systems. You've got wet electrodes, which have failed so far in every device that someone has tried to make an at-home version using wet electrodes on the head. There have been some really good attempts. There have been some really good technology. It just really, really hard to get consumer adoption for wet electrodes on the heads. You can kind of get away with it if you're doing something like a TENS device where you can do it on the leg or something and you don't need people to clean the area very well, things like that. But on the head, it's a problem. Dry electrodes on EEG, the very best commercially available dry electrode system for the heads that I've tested is actually Muse. The brain sensing headband is their tagline. Now, because their use case is meditation and they're wanting you to keep still, it's perfect. The problem with dry electrodes for EEG is that they do not tolerate really any movement at all. So that was our limiting factor. So we had the system that worked with EEG that we couldn't find a way to actually build into a standalone device where we could automate that feedback loop. Just let me go forward for a little bit. I'll come back to those previous slides. We did a very large number of small test studies with the EEG system, but we were stuck because we couldn't figure out a way to build it into a standalone automated system. So going back to this, what the valence cell sensor allowed us to do was to replace all of the EEG with the valence cell sensor on the forehead, which allowed us to look at heart rate variability, and specifically the high frequency components of heart rate variability. And we're now looking at a combination of HRV metrics in order to get a more accurate algorithm for measuring pain, stress, and relaxation.
Richard, if I could interrupt just very briefly, we did have a question come in asking about are the eyes open in the user experience?
No, so the eyes are actually closed, and you're doing it through closed eyelids. And yeah, so that's a very good question. So the color of the light is calibrated to be what we want the color to be through eyelids. Does that make sense?
Yep, sure does. Thanks.
So going back to the original EEG work, one of the most important things we discovered was um, whenever you have severe pain, especially in the context of traumatic brain injury, um, you have a signature EEG where you have a very large disparity between the two hemispheres in the brain. So on the left, you're looking at left hemisphere versus right hemisphere, 1 to 30 hertz. And on the right, you're looking at the same person's EEG profile from 1 to 30 after a cumulative 4 hours of using the device. Now, what that balancing allows you to do is to then get someone from flight into rest and recovery. So we can now use the HRV sensor to basically work out whether the device is being effective and are we getting someone from fight flight into rest and recovery. Lots of IP. Valence have obviously themselves discovered the importance of IP for fending off people copying what you're doing. And I can answer questions on that if people have them later. The pilot studies, so we did a lot of small anecdotal testing, everything from pain to stroke to with the US Air Force on increasing resistance to G-lock, which is where you pass out because you've gone around a corner too fast in a jet plane. And that actually kills more pilots than have died in combat in all wars up to the end of the Korean War. The issue with all those pilots is that they, after basically every single one of them proved effective, we just didn't have the so what. We didn't have the device that people could use after I left with all of my gear, and hence the need for creating the standalone device that I just showed you earlier.
Richard, one more question has come in, if I may interrupt.
Absolutely.
Question is, how long do you have to measure high frequency HRV to get a result?
Basically a minute. So it depends on how accurate you need to be. We're getting a good result by doing it in 1 minute increments.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
One of the great things about the Lensell sensor is the ability to get signal strength data alongside your actual signal. And obviously, if you go down to a lower signal strength because you've got more movement, then it would be advisable to extend that period of time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of our customers use that signal quality indicator as a way to know whether or not to use the data coming in for their assessment. So that's good to hear you're using that.
Yeah, no, it's totally essential and very useful part, especially in the testing phases.
Yeah.
This was our first client using a standalone version of the device. I actually made this prototype, as you can probably see, from Google Glass parts, because we had to make it in 5 weeks flat for Solar Impulse, so the plane that was flying around the world on solar power. The pilot in that situation had to open his eyes and immediately see his dashboard and display, so we couldn't have a covering the eyes version. Turned out to be very useful for chronic regional pain syndrome, where someone the visual connection with the pain that they had she had in her arms was extremely useful. So we managed to get her to back to school for the first time in 3 years, after 1 week of using the device. Just as a side point for people developing technologies, well, not a side point, and one of my really key learnings about this whole process is that whether I think it's probably the same in a small company or a big company, data is key. And my biggest mistake as a startup was trying to go straight from a whole bunch of anecdotal data, which was really impressive from my point of view, to a full-blown double-blind RCT trial done by an independent third party. Now, that's trying to jump from one end of the ladder to the other. And actually, what you really need to do is you need to get the next level of data, the next level up the credibility ladder that you can get quickly and cheaply and simply, and then carry on getting the next level of data after that. So we spent a lot of time, wasted time, trying to get independent third parties to develop and do clinical trial protocols without having done the sort of quicker, less rigorous versions ourselves. This 75-person study was us internally getting help from a bunch of people, but still us running it. So it's not the gold standard of what you want with data, but it was a really good stepping stone. And what we did was I got help from Stanford, having sort of tried to get them to run an experiment and running into all of the legal issues that happen when you try and run a trial with a medical teaching school. You have IP issues, you have contract issues. Expect it to take a year from the moment you start talking about a trial to when you actually get it going. But instead, I had a friendly professor to give me 15 students. Special Operations Command gave me 28 soldiers, Special Forces guys, and the East Bay Chronic Pain Group also provided me with a bunch of people who were willing to be tested on who had severe pain. Anyway, we did a very tightly controlled 15 minutes of device use versus 15 minutes of sham. And we got a doubling of relaxation in 15 minutes against that sham, a tripling or reduction in pain levels, and a 5x improvement in recovery and sleep. Now, that recovery and sleep was as measured by the high frequency component of HRV and how we were changing that. And again, measuring that on the sensor on the forehead. Then we moved on, so that then allowed us to raise more money. That allowed us to go to basically one of the top 5 addiction and pain specialists in the country, world recognized, world renowned, Dr. Lynn Webster. And that was done at a CRO, contract research organization, that he runs, called PRA Health Sciences in Salt Lake City. 8-patient crossover study looking at methadone addicts in full withdrawal. Basically, we wanted to find a situation of how can we get the most stress you can possibly get someone in a clinical setting in an ethical and reliable way. And methadone withdrawal turned out to be an ideal situation, because if you take methadone, you have to take breaks from taking methadone in order for methadone to maintain its effectiveness. If you don't, your body acclimatizes to it, and then over time, the methadone loses its effectiveness. So long-term methadone users have to go on these breaks from using methadone, and it's pretty much the most extreme stress that we could imagine being able to ethically get in the hospital. And then again, we were looking at the use of the device versus placebo, and we got reductions. We beat sham in every thing we looked at, from subjective opioid withdrawal symptoms, clinical opioid withdrawal symptoms. This is basically a doc looking at things like pupil dilation, blood pressure, so on. The anxiety scores were the best of all. Even on a small sample size, we hit statistical significance. If you think about the end of your first day of withdrawal, that's when withdrawal symptoms are actually at their absolute worst. And that was when we were getting the greatest difference over sham for the amount of anxiety people were suffering and the alleviation. Pain scores also hit statistical significance. Reduction in need for opioids, reduction in desire for opioids. So that was the opioid use disorder study. those of you who are interested in going through FDA, it's a long process, but if you're doing external wearable devices, the chances are that you're going to be considered as non-significant risk. The FDA is never going to say you're non-significant risk. They're going to say the next best thing, which is if your independent review board says you're NSR, then you're NSR. That means you can do trials much more easily. But it's something to bear in mind for those that are developing devices measuring things like heart rate variability on an external sensor. We are now filing de novo for opioid use disorder. We expect to be through the FDA process by the end of September on that. As a device, you have two components to your FDA. One is the design history file, which is basically, are you making exactly what you say you're making, and is it doing exactly what you say it's doing? And that's a good 70–75% of the paperwork. The other 25% of the paperwork is, does what you're saying actually then produce clinical efficacy in a safe way? So yes, there's a very large amount of hardware paperwork that goes into any device submission to the FDA. We've got we've got a fibromyalgia trial, which is now started in its second week. We're hoping to get that through FDA in a shorter time frame because it's a breakthrough designation. We've got a severe pain study starting after that, neuropathic pain, and then oncology pain. We've got, I think, about 10 other trials that we've already got in the planning exchange from everyone from the VA to Cleveland Clinic to on all sorts of different applications. So lots of things you can do with external devices that are getting people into a more relaxed state. I was a lone operator for many years. I then hired a couple of people, and then very soon I realized we needed medical technology experience. So I hired a chief operating officer with a very large amount of medical device experience, Tasha, who actually then was already Boulder based, so that caused us to move from the Bay Area to Boulder. Jeff Burkett, he was actually formerly head of neuroscience at AstraZeneca. Having someone who really knows your subject area is utterly critical. And then Steve, who is the adult in the room that tries to make sure we don't spend outside the budget and keeps us on track. So that's us and that's the story. And I really look forward to lots of questions.
Excellent. Great stuff, Richard. Thank you. Just for those of you who may have logged in late, if you have any questions, please do submit those through the GoToWebinar control panel. And I'll start off, Richard, just curious about having been through several different trials now, curious about your recommendations for people who may be approaching that process and wondering about your recommendations for how to be most successful in the trial process.
Yeah, so I kind of alluded to parts of it earlier, but really I think the key thing is to think about data and data credibility as a ladder. And you always want to take the next step on the ladder, not jump right to the top. If you try to jump right to the top, you waste a very large amount of time and money, because you can't persuade clinicians to run long-term trials without the data to support your story from the start. So starts on the bench test, then it's early volunteers, then it's moving into small patient signal studies, and the moment you can get up to something like 8 or 10 people, at that point it's very much worth hiring external stats support to get someone to go over your data from an external statistician's point of view, and then the larger trials. So the key thing, from my point of view, of the lessons I've learned is around it is around getting that staging right, one stage at a time. The quickest, easiest thing you can do next. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes great sense. A couple of questions have come in around different applications or different markets where this could potentially be applied. So one of which specifically was athletes could possibly be targeted users pre and post games, or especially tough in sports. Is that something you're thinking about?
Yeah, so that's kind of also actually where we started. So the first commercial user was actually the special forces in the UK for improving physical performance. Of the sports teams in the US, the last one to test last year was the San Jose Sharks, and again that was around sleep issues to do with travel, pain and recovery issues. I mean, the typical hockey player basically gets beaten up on the ice, and then has to go to the next game. So typically they would get into the hotel of the next place they were staying around about 1 a.m. in the morning. So brutal travel schedules, lots of wear and tear. Yeah, it's a really important area. The reason why we sort of backed off it a bit, and we'll go back to it in due course, is that it's extremely hard for any company to start consumer and then go medical. There are very, very few examples of startups that have managed and succeeded to do that. That's more of a big company game. You're much better off having the discipline starting as a medical device company and then going into consumer. And the sports area is largely the consumer area. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, that makes great sense. It's not just from a regulatory standpoint on the starting with medical, but it brings immediate credibility in it once you do enter the consumer market.
Yeah, exactly. And it is also the engineering discipline. When Samsung has a whole bunch of phones where the batteries explode, they don't know where those phones have gone, so they have to recall all the phones. Jawbone equivalent problems back in the day. As a startup, it's really expensive to be a medical device to start off with, but the benefit is you know exactly where every single device has gone. You know where every batch of every batteries and every other critical component, you know where those devices are, because you have to. And so if you run into a problem, you can immediately solve that problem just with the devices that had those faulty components in them. That kind of rigor is just an example of all of the engineering rigor you have to have. It was really tough for us, even from a prototype stage, to switch from consumer to medical. I would not advise anybody to do it later than that prototype stage. My poor COO basically took on a Herculean task converting us from a consumer company to a medical company, but we did do it early enough. So yeah, it's a really important decision point. If someone is thinking about doing medical things, get your medical device in people really early.
Indeed. A couple of questions around more on the technical aspects of how the device is working from a physiological standpoint. One of the questions is, what's the mechanism which reduces fight or flight?
The main one is frequency following response. So whatever frequency you put into the brain will adopt that frequency. With transcranial magnetic stimulation, you are doing that directly with a magnetic field. Electrics also, you're doing it electrically with an electric current. We're doing it by stimulating the auditory and visual cortex to send the signals we want into the brain. There are different brainwave pattern profiles associated with all the different states that we are dealing with, but that's essentially how it's working.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, and that another follow-on question here was, I think, related to that of why is high frequency HRV reduction being triggered by sound plus light? I think what you just described is then reflected in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system response. But
yeah, that's correct.
Know that much better than I do, so I'll let you address that one.
Yeah, no, that is actually correct. And I mean, just to another point that on the sort of clinical trial route, we've had a lot of feedback from grant-based organizations who basically said, it's great that you're getting really good clinical data. It's great that you've got your theories about how this works, and the area in which you need to improve is the lab and bench testing of how those 2 points link up. And that's the process we're going through right now. Trials are being designed right now with West Virginia University for studying very well laid out, well established pain models, in particular cold press. So you're basically looking at applying a cold stimulus to healthy people to look at their pain tolerance, because that's a very well understood model of how pain works. And then simultaneously doing that with EEG and EKG to basically prove all of that mechanism of action and how it's working. So that is another thing for people to bear in mind. It's what are those things that are considered standard lab tests that you can do to prove out the mechanism of action, because that's what we're going through right now.
Yep, got it. More of a commercial question here. There's a company, someone from a company in Norway who works with heart rate variability and a variety of different organizations similar to the ones you have worked with. Question is, how much is the device and when can we start using it? They think the product is great. So
I really appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, so we're hoping to be through FDA for opioid use disorder at the end of September. Fibromyalgia, we could be through by September. And then obviously it's an engineering challenge to get our cost of goods down from its current level to levels that consumers will be happy with. But yeah, FDA first. So look out in Q3, hopefully.
Cool. One other question around, well, the question is there a dosage dependent result from the use?
Okay, so well, that question usually comes from two different directions. Either the direction of, can this thing be addictive? And the answer is absolutely not. And the other question sort of comes around, what does it take in order to get a long-term result? And that really depends on the type of pain. So we are one way that we look at pain is we look at and there are different words for this, like first pain, second pain is one the way I've seen some of the textbooks describe it. But the way I look at it is the initial cause of pain and then the central mediation of that pain. So you've got how the brain processes a pain signal, and then you've got the initial pain itself. So in spinal injuries, my example in particular, when I broke my back, there was a very large amount of signals going up my spine that my brain couldn't actually interpret. They weren't actually pain signals. They were just a very, very messy signal. So it's very similar to phantom limb. So with me, the device was able to completely and utterly wipe out all of my nerve damage pain in 3 months and I haven't had more than 10 seconds at a time of nerve damage pain since then. So all intents and purposes, it fixed it permanently over a 3-month period, using it 3 or 4 times a day. On the other end of the scale is someone like Hattie with CRPS, complex regional pain syndrome, where we aren't fixing the underlying condition, because the underlying condition is not in how the brain is processing pain. But what we are doing is allowing a management effect. So her reduction stays as long as she's continuing to use the device, and is staying at that sort of 50% of her max pain level. It's staying at that managed level while she continues to use the device. We haven't had anybody who accommodates to the device and their pain comes back, essentially. And what's the other? When someone asks that question, there is a yeah. Let me ask that person if they have follow-up questions of something specific that they want to know that I haven't covered.
Cool. Yeah, I had a quick follow-up question. When you say as long as they continue to use the device, or in Hattie's case, as long as she continues to use the device, you mean as long as she's using it periodically over the day, not necessarily when she has the mask on. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, correct. So basically, chronic pain is maladaptive neuroplasticity. So your brain is permanently trying to figure out how to do things more efficiently. And if you learn a language, learn a skill, your brain's working out how do I do what I'm supposed to do with less effort. And when you're trying to learn something new, that's all a positive experience. Chronic pain is basically that neuroplasticity still going on in exactly the same way, but in a way that is not helpful. And what we're doing with the device is we're putting the brain back into a more neuroplastic state whilst the person is more relaxed. So that's the sort of 2 things to look at. One is we're getting an initial decrease in pain because someone's more relaxed. The other is we are enabling increase in neuroplasticity. So over time, you're shifting the baseline of pain back to what it was in a pre-chronic level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And there was a follow-up question along those lines of how often does the device typically need to be used, and for how long for each usage?
15 minutes is round about the average for a single use. And the number of uses a week is highly variable depending on the person. So we've had people with all sorts of chronic pain who use it just when they're getting what's called breakthrough pain. What I'd always used to call a pain spike, where pain starts to get out of control, and then using the device to control it. That tends to be sort of 3 or 4 uses a week. Other people like Hattie, where it's a much more severe pain problem that's happening the whole time, she started using the device about 4 hours a day, and then tapered off to round about 45 minutes a day on average. So it really depends on how much pain someone's in, how debilitating it is to their life. I mean, my advice is usually around, if you are in too much pain to do what you want to do, then use the device. Because there's no maximum, because essentially we're providing a metronome to the brain. So we consider that we have the safety profile higher than meditation, because meditation, once you go beyond the sort of 4 or 5 hours a day, if you're doing it without guidance, there are psychological dangers there that happen in an extremely small number of cases, but we consider ourselves even safer than that. And in that comparison with meditation, obviously we're not providing any of the wisdom that meditation can produce. we're providing the hardware changes that that long-term type of meditation can give.
Fascinating. A few more questions have come in. Let's see. Has there been any study on people who are in a vegetative state? If tried on that, any recovery observed?
Yeah. So we had one subject who was in a waking vegetative state, so eyes open, unable to communicate, hadn't communicated for 12 years, from a blow to the back of the head from a piece of scaffolding sticking out from behind a truck. He was walking along the side of the road and got hit on the back of the head. Over the course of about 3 days, we got him communicating with his thumb, and that was the first communication in 12 years. That experience was the one that made me really want to switch from where we were to being a medical device, because trying to think how to phrase this. The parents were continuing to shake that kid. Sorry, let me just cut a long story short there. We weren't able to control the care of that patient after we produced that first bit of change. And that became an issue for me, because I really thought, had we had medical standing, we would have been able to produce long-term care. So some interesting, useful early findings, and something we will go back to in due course. More recently at Mount Sinai, there was a subject who had a brainstem stroke and had pain and sleep issues from that, and the device has proven very effective in helping sleep problems that he had, and also the reducing the amount of pain he's suffering. So those are areas that in due course we will absolutely go back to and study properly. The first one of those two was in a time when it was in the UK, and it was prior to the rigor that we're trying to apply to everything we're now doing. So it's an area that's really important, and we really want to do it. It's just going to take us a while to actually get to the kind of clinical trials that kind of a condition really deserves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's like I always come from a background of running around trying anything that I think is going to help anybody, and that isn't actually the sensible way of helping a lot of people, because the sensible way to help a lot of people is to have the rigor to go through all of the processes in this country that the FDA outlines, that is there for people's safety. I know a lot of people regard the FDA as a roadblock and as something to overcome, but I have to say, from our point of view as a non-significant risk device, they have been unbelievably helpful and supportive of helping us get through the processes that keep people safe. And I look back at some of what I did in the early days, and I was convinced we had a totally safe device, but I look back now and think, I'm glad for the oversight that we now have to make sure that we do everything in the safest way possible.
Yeah, absolutely. A few other questions have come in. These are great questions, by the way. Keep them coming. The next question is around my HRV data is dominated by the parasympathetic state. I also have chronic pain. Does my low stress level indicate that I can expect less of an effect from the device since the quote potential for reducing the stress is relatively low?
Yes and no. It depends on what the cause of the pain is. If that person wants to say some follow-up details to you, that would be great. The yeah, so the immediate drop is typically because of the increase in relaxation, but it depends on whether that levels of pain in the long term is being caused by maladaptive neuroplasticity or its actual pain signal. So one example where we've just had 1 or 2 people is trigeminal face pain, and one of those we had some good success with, the other one we didn't, and it seems to be the quality or the sort of the type of the signal that's coming up to the brain as to whether or not we can get those larger changes.
Got it. Yeah, the questioner did follow up and say I have neck and shoulder pain, mainly from surgery. I don't know if that changes anything about the answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's then there is a reasonable chance because the neck and shoulder pain is more likely to be have a large chronic component, have a component of the brains has maladaptively rewired to be more sensitive to it. One thing I would say to that person is just to talk to your physician about what pain meds you are taking. I had a personal experience with neck muscle pain, and I got radical improvements when I stopped taking all non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. It turns out that non-steroidal anti-inflammatories actually disrupt bone, muscle, and cartilage repair. And I originally read about this in a book called Mistakes That Athletes Make. It was about myths that athletes believe in, and it was quoting articles in the quoting a research article in the British Medical Journal. So that person with neck and shoulder pain, I would my advice would be to consult with your physician about what pain meds you're taking in the short term, and just make sure that you're not taking things that are actually making the situation harder for you. And in the medium term, I very much hope that we can help you as well with the device.
Got it. Yep. Similar question of, or I guess a tangential question of, does the location of the pain make a difference? And if so, what?
Things closer to the head are always harder. And that's, I think that's just sort of, I mean, it doesn't make it much harder for us, but it makes it harder for someone to get into a relaxed state. If you've got, you could have a toe that is wickedly broken, an impinged nerve in your toe, and the ability of your brain to block that signal out is much larger than if it's in your neck or your head. I mean, migraine is one of the most debilitating types of pain there is, and it is an area as well that in future we do want to look at because we've had some good anecdotal data. But yes, it obviously makes a difference to the sufferer. So far, it doesn't seem to make a difference to how the device is working. It's more to do with what signal is actually going into the brain.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I realize we're a few minutes over the top of the hour, but we do have a couple of other questions. Richard, do you have a few more minutes?
Absolutely, absolutely. I was late, so absolutely.
Okay. Slightly
also,
different.
I want to say I appreciate these questions because these are some good in-depth questions.
Yeah, agreed. Slightly different question topic here of, do you anticipate health insurance providers to might require the use of the Santa device as an alternative to approving a prescription for opioids?
I think that's extremely unlikely that it'll be required. I mean, I think more likely is some of the federal moves towards requiring any alternative to be used prior to opioids. I think that realistically could be coming down the pipeline for certain scenarios. I don't imagine a private insurer choosing one of many pain solutions and saying you have to do this before you do opioids. I think that's extremely unlikely. It's also, you know, what is done should always be the physician's call. We really want to be a solution in the toolkit, and for the people who we can particularly help, you know, maybe we can be a silver bullet for a small number of people. I would love that. The vast majority of people, we are going to be a tool in the toolkit. What we've seen with long-term users of painkillers is we've seen around about a 30 to 50% voluntary drop in opioids. And what typically seems to be happening is on a moment-by-moment basis, someone's making the choice. Do I want to take these painkillers, which I know are going to have X, Y, Z side effects? Like, you know, I'm going to be groggy, I can't drive, I can't spend time with my kids. Or do I want to use a device right now, which is not going to wipe me out, so probably is going to lower my pain less than the opioids, but it's giving me the choice and freedom to do other stuff. I started figuring this out because the feedback we were getting from some of the anecdotal users was you reduced my pain was a second or third bit of feedback in most cases. It wasn't the first. First was always something around giving people more freedom, more choice, or more control. So I would loathe a scenario where we are used in any way to reduce the amount of control people have over what goes into their bodies, and I will fight extremely strongly to make sure that we are an additional choice and never something that someone has to do first. That's just the way I feel about it. I just, people should be trusted to do what's best for them. There are many types of pain where, take for example, some types of oncology pain. You better hope that you can get your hands on the strongest opioids that are available, and that's appropriate, because if you're in a position where you can't do anything else, your quality of life is the most important thing. So I really strongly believe that we want to be giving people more control, because I also believe that giving people more control actually reduces anxiety, which just giving them more control, because it's reducing anxiety, is also reducing pain, just because they've got access to another choice. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant. That was a bit of me on my soapbox, but that's kind of how I feel about it.
That is quite all right. That's good stuff. Another question around hypertension, actually. Are there hypertension applications, and is this a goal for you?
We've seen blood pressure drops in the same way that you expect to with meditation. It's obviously something that was looked at with regards to opioid withdrawal and severe pain. We haven't done a study yet on a cohort of people with no other problems. That is obviously something that is on the wish list. It's not that it's below all the pain stuff at the moment. because our aim is to help the people who need it most first. And although blood pressure medication does not work for everyone, it's a very strong solution that's out there, but it is something I would like to get to in due course to help. Because I know even with the best blood medication, there is still a component of it that is left that is not being treated. So it's definitely an area I want to help in. But I have to apologize and say it is below all of the severe pain ones at the moment in the list of priorities.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I hate telling anybody that what they're suffering with is a lower priority for us, but I also want to be realistic about timeframes and how long it's going to take us to do some things.
Yeah, certainly. There was a quick follow-up question on that, which is the response to the device or the treatment higher or lower with hypertensive patients? Have you seen anything along those lines?
Not yet, but we have a tagline line here around, non-responders are our best friends. All of our best results have been in groups that are not responding to other treatments. So we really, we're trying to focus our clinical trials on the people who are having the largest problems that are unhelped by other things. So while we haven't seen that specifically on hypertension, it really wouldn't surprise me at all.
Got it. Got it. Well, in looking through everything else that has come in, there don't seem to be any other questions, just a lot of thanks for an outstanding webinar, and really appreciate your time. So I will second that. And Richard, thank you very much for taking the time to share your story, and really appreciate what you guys are working on. It's obviously a significant problem, and it's great to see that you guys are getting very good traction with this and helping address a major issue. So congrats so far.
One is to everyone listening and the good questions, really appreciate it. And the second is to you guys at Valencell. Had you not produced a sensor that allowed us to ditch the EEG and actually make something that someone could use at home, we wouldn't be where we are. So thank you to you too.
We are honored to be a part of it.
Cool.
So with that, I'll just remind everyone we have been recording this, and we'll make the recording available to everyone who is registered, as well as the slides that Richard shared. And we'll send those out via email within the next 24 hours or so. So please do share those with anyone who you think might be interested. And I'll just thank everyone again for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. We hope you found it valuable, and be sure to look for the next webinars coming up from Valencell. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.
Cheers.
Cheers.